on camps that are planning to open or are leaning towards opening. Of course, we have many camps here who have already chosen to close or are planning to close. And as Matt said at the beginning of the last session, I think it's important to remind members here, please keep these comments confidential, especially when you know that certain camps have not made important announcements public yet. It's, as we heard, even more so in the last session, there's a lot of planning that goes into those decisions. So we need to be respectful of other camps and their decision. And that follows along with a really nice theme we heard last session with camps who were leaning towards closing or who had already closed, which is there shouldn't be any judgment in these decisions. Everyone needs to make these decisions for their own camp. And sometimes it's a board making those decisions in conjunction with an executive director. Sometimes it's family members. Sometimes it's different members of a camp family making those decisions. And we really need to be respectful of that. And we've been hearing that more and more from main camps, being respectful of one another's decisions. And I look forward to seeing that trend continue. Just one other housekeeping note. Please do keep in touch with Ron if you decide to either alter the dates of your camp session or to close. He is keeping an excellent list that is going to be important to keep track not only of numbers, but who needs support in different areas as we move forward. Thank you to Bobby and Terry. Is she able to be here, Matt?
I'm here.
Oh, I see her. Hi, Terry. Thank you.
Hi.
So we've got a couple folks who have volunteered or voluntold to be on the panel today. Thank you. And we did ask Norm, I'm sorry, not Norm, Tom Doherty from Camp Ketcha to represent day camps, and he had a conflict. So we will try and answer, Matt and I will answer any day camp questions that come out because that come up because we've been working on behalf of day camps. Absolutely. Bobby's going to represent a little bit more of a private independent camp, and Terry's going to talk a little bit more about a nonprofit charitable camp. And I'm going to have them introduce themselves, and then we'll start in on some questions. Please feel free to type any questions into the chat, and we will monitor those as we go along. Bobby, why don't you start?
Sure. Bobby Strauss from Camp Wigwam. Camp Wigwam was founded in 1910. And from what I understand from the history of Camp Wigwam, there never was a season to date that has been either postponed or canceled, which is pretty unbelievable. And I did sit in on that last session, and obviously our hearts went out to those that decided that they could not open. We believe that we can, obviously pending the procedures and policies by the state of Maine, but I'm here to absolutely answer any questions that you think we could. And I have a couple of subjects that I'll mention now that if anybody wants to talk about, I think they warrant discussion. That would be, of course, staff orientation time, bringing your staff here and how we're all going to do that. Travel day among campers, another interesting subject. Programming, how programming will change this summer, obviously, with no intercamp and very, very few out of camp programs. Staff time off. We could go till 5 o'clock on that one today, I'm sure. And of course, the issue of off-campus staff, how we're handling that. Just a few subjects, anybody wants to raise those. And thanks so much. I'll go back to mute for a little while.
Great. Thank you again for joining us, Bobby. And Terry, could you introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm Terry Mulks. I'm the director at Camp Susan Curtis. We are a small nonprofit serving only Maine children. And we are, as all of us are, trying to figure out exactly what's going on and what we can do, and really pushing kind of hard because we want to make sure that our Maine kids who have been without support since the middle of March are able to come to the place that they consider, you know, a very stable place. And we're also thinking along the lines of, you know, what we can do out in the community if we only have smaller number of kids here. So that's kind of a different angle that we're taking also. So looking forward to fattening up with everyone.
All right, that's great. Terry, can you start off? Can you, Bobby gave us a great list, so I'm just going to steal right from him. Can you start off with telling us how you're approaching staff orientation and training right now? What are some of your ideas around that?
We've actually kind of already started that already. I've been reaching out to the staff on a regular basis to just let them know that we don't know what's going on, but that we're trying to hold it together, because I really don't want them to go out and find other jobs right now. So we've been doing a lot of online stuff, getting them to do the State of Maine mandated reporter training. We're part of the Redwoods Institute, so they had 5 or 6 different videos that they were looking at for that. Beyond that, I think a lot of it's just going to depend on what our dates look like as far as getting people in here. And we usually only have our staff for a week before campers start, but it looks like we're going to need to come up with something for 2 weeks before campers start. So I'm just working with my board on that, but we are going to have less sessions than we normally have. So I feel like it'll all kind of work itself out as far as what that looks like.
Great. Bobby, how about you guys in staff training? What are you thinking?
Oh, no question. And we have some questions on this, of course. So yes, we're going to try and get every staff member here 2 weeks before the start date. And we're going to ask every one of those staff members to quarantine for 2 weeks before they come here. And then whatever mode of transportation they use, we're obviously going to do whatever we possibly can to test them upon arrival. And obviously then do temperature checks on a regular basis, but isolate here at camp with social distancing during orientation week, in the hopes that we can somehow guarantee that we get a clean and healthy staff population before the campers get here. And
Yeah,
of course, isolated in that once they're here, nobody's leaving until the campers come.
You both bring up very good points that have yet to be clarified by the state's final guidelines, but we do anticipate that there will be some form of a 14-day quarantine. In what group size for your staff, we're unsure. That's going to be certainly part of it. And another part that will probably be in there is some form of a pre-quarantine before they even come on to your property. And there will be checklists about between upwards of 7, maybe 14 days even before they come to your property to quarantine for another 14 days. And there may be checklists about daily temperature checks and negative signs of persistent cough, headache, other things such as that. Again, it's a good idea to be working forward with both of those requirements in mind, both an on-site quarantine and a pre-quarantine at home. So, and like we said earlier, we hope to get more clarification of that on May 20th next week. All right, great. Matt, you mind reading some of the questions in the chat there?
Yeah, there was a good one that came up. Alexis had said, and I think this is in response to something that Bobby brought up, why fewer sessions? What caused the decision? Curious about length of sessions.
I had responded to her about that. We're having less sessions because we normally start in June. So our original start date was June 21st, and obviously we had to shift. We also have to keep in mind that a lot of our staff will need to go back to whatever is happening in the fall, but we have a lot of teachers who are going to need to be in their classrooms starting around mid-August. So we still needed to meet our mid-August end date, and that's why fewer sessions.
Okay, and there's also numerous questions popping up around the idea of staff quarantining off-site. Bobby, can you just sort of elaborate on that a little bit more? Bex had said, is it necessary to do a 14-day quarantine for staff, we only have 4 days available for pre-camp, and either Bobby or Laura might be able to chime in.
Sure, I can start that if you want, Laura, because that
Mhm.
presents an interesting point. What about a staff member who cannot, for one reason or another, be quarantined here at camp for 14 days before you start? But the interesting part about that is that when your camper group arrives, that's pretty much the same story, because you're trusting them to quarantine at home, and then they're arriving. So your camper that might come late becomes the same population as that. It's that new person coming into your camp, and obviously then you start their quarantine period as you're going to do when your campers arrive. The other point I want to make, I think, is on the off-campus staff, because all of us understand that in a perfect world, you wouldn't have off-campus staff, but we all have errands to run without question. We all have, so you're going to have that person that is your off-campus staff that runs between errands and camp and never enters camp. Maybe they bring whatever it might be to a staging area. And so I think that works for all of us. But then there's the issue of the living off campus staff that have jobs at camp. Can you have that staff member? And I think, depending on what the state of Maine ultimately says, you can have that staff member, I think, as long as they have no contact with any of your camp population. If they're early morning blowing off courts or mowing grass or checking gasoline in the ski boats or whatever, that person, I think, could possibly do that as long as they don't have any direct contact with campers, I guess. And so I have a question about that one, of course, too. And then finally, when we get a camper that needs to go to the doctor, I think that needs to be one of your on-campus staff, because that person's coming back. So I have questions on those that anybody is welcome to answer on those.
Yeah, those are great, and we're going to try and keep up as much as we can here. I'll really quickly say that, yes, we do anticipate guidelines for what they're calling local workers coming to and from your camp daily, and they will have a screening guideline. Someone asked what that screening guideline is going to look like. We're awaiting that, but we do feel confident that there's going to be a way for people who live locally in your community and who work on your property to come in safely, again, via a similar screening. Many of us might have heard of these already at hospitals for healthcare workers are going through it every day because they leave the hospital and they come back, and every day there's a general screening that they have to go through, temperature, denying of certain other signs and symptoms such as persistent headache, persistent cough. So we will be working on getting those to you. And someone seems to have oh, Pam, thank you. Pam got it right there in the chat. Also, I see a lot of questions about the 14-day quarantine. Boy, this is something we wish we could have a concrete answer for you right now, and we do not. We are still awaiting guidance from the state, and we do expect that this will have some movement to it, because you've all heard of Hospitality Maine and Maine Tourism really doing the forefront argument about this is impossible for the economy, for hotels and restaurants to handle in July if it's still a requirement for the phase 3 that you have to have 14 days. So we're using that term right now, but it is still quote unquote a placeholder, which means the state is hoping to develop something in place of a 14-day on-site quarantine. They have not released what that is. It's probably going to be some form of a pre-quarantine before you arrive in the state, or pre-screening, or testing, or a combination of all those things. So we're going to stay tuned for that. Matt, what's our next question? Maybe to go to Terry here. I'm sorry, I did see one about day camps, and we promised we would talk about day camps.
Yeah. I'll get to the day camp question quickly, but Laura, just quickly, while we're still on the 14-day quarantine rule, Andrew had asked, what are people's policies for in-state versus out-of-state campers, and the 14-day quarantine rule for campers? Can you just clarify the state sort of has made a distinction between in-state versus out-of-state campers already, right?
Yeah, for June, they have for
Okay.
technically phase 2. So if you are trying to have your staff arrive on site in June to quarantine, you are either, again, more details to come, going to have to quarantine Maine residents versus non-Maine residents, or you are going to have to quarantine into groups smaller than 10. And that is still a 14-day quarantine. So that if you're looking at June staff training, though you will be held to a higher standard in the anticipation that we do as a state move into phase 3 on time on July 1st. There will be possibly, that's where I said the term placeholder. They're working more in a phase 3, changing that idea of 14 days, although we're not sure what that's going to look like. Right now, I can tell you what Winona's planning, which is when our staff arrive at the beginning of July, we are trying to plan right now for a 14-day, because there's nothing else been given to us. And Maine resident staff and out-of-state resident staff are going to then quarantine together as a bubble in smaller, safe groups within camp, and they are all going to have pre-screening requirements before coming to camp. So we're trying to do a combination. I certainly understand that not all camps will have that 14 days to work with that, but it does adjust well for Winona's usual calendar, and so that's what we're moving forward with. But for other camps, we're still fighting hard to find out what the alternatives are going to be.
So I want to just sort of move the conversation around to day camps for a minute, because I think this is one of those questions that's a particularly thorny one, is around check-in and check-out for day camps. And Mary asked, check-in and check-out is always a beast, particularly on Mondays. Add to that mandatory health checks. Does anyone else have good plans for that? We have around 150 kids a day from 2 to 13 years old. Just seems like it's going to be a lot. Add to that the weekly turnover of kids, and it's a ton of potential exposure for staff. So I know that those day camp guidelines from the state are coming out next Wednesday, but anything around these ideas or these questions of check-in and out that we can anticipate?
Yeah, she listed them all. Thank you. There's a lot. I will say that the state is very supportive of day camps reopening. They want day camps to open because they know that essential workers and parents who need a safe spot for their kids need summer day camps to open. So I do expect to see, as a group, Micah expects to see the day camp guidelines to be very similar to daycare guidelines, which have already been released. So if you want to have an outline, I would say check out the daycare guidelines. The drop-off, pickup, we've seen some basic outlines. One person in the car with the child or children who are being dropped off, not the whole family comes to drop off. The parent who's driving does not get out of the vehicle. The day camp needs to be prepared to have groups of 10 or fewer, and keep to those groups of children and counselors as much as possible. And then there is one benefit to the day camp, right? Well, there's many benefits, but one in this particular situation, you can enlist the parents to help you with screening on a regular basis. They will be seeing their child every afternoon when they get picked up, and with them in the morning and throughout the evening. And so you're really going to want to have the parents very much do a daily screening for those signs and symptoms, so that you're keeping anyone who's sick, even if you don't think it's COVID, anyone who's sick stays out of day camp.
Moving along to the idea of sports and activities, because I think this is universally of concern. Do we have any indications yet, either in the EHE guidelines that have been developed in conjunction with ACA, or anything from the state regarding the status of contact sports and other activities that bring kids into close physical proximity, I guess? Anyone?
Again, I don't think we're going to see actual activities that are canceled. But I do know certain camps who have chosen to close because their programmings were based on traditional sports and competitions. And those are going to be hard in their the traditional way that you play competitive sports to maintain the level of distancing and safety, especially within groups of campers who haven't been cohorting for a safe period of time together. Bobby, what are you folks thinking about sports?
Wow, we were just turning back and forth, as you may have seen here. So, you know, obviously it's not just the contact sports, it's dodgeball. That ball's being thrown around by everybody and maybe hitting somebody on their mouth, or they touch their mouth or face and then go to the ball. Softball, same idea. You know, I think ultimately we're going to try to disinfect as often as we can before and after all these sports, in that before you leave that venue, everybody's washing. We're washing the balls, the equipment, disinfecting as we open and leave an activity. Because as we said, it's not just the contact, it's the contact with the equipment as well. Any thoughts?
Terry, what are you thinking about along those same guidelines about activity equipment?
I think it's mostly what Bobby was talking about, just trying to figure out how to best disinfect everything between uses, kind of waiting for the ACA guidelines around that, because I think there's going to be some specific checklists there to look at. And one of the things we're trying to figure out is, you know, we have, obviously we're a camp, we have a lot of equipment and a lot of different things. So one of the things that we're trying to figure out is setting up like our storage and our program areas so that it's very specific to, this has been disinfected and can be used. You know, this is stuff that needs to be, so some sort of system, I guess, of like disinfection and what's in rotation and how that's going to work. And I think in looking at that and sitting down and looking at it with the staff team, there's going to be some things we're not going to be able to clean or disinfect. And so those are the activities that are going to have to take a little rest this summer.
I see Chelsea's put some guidelines in the chat there. Thank you for that. And I do think that we've talked about this earlier, that the ACA field guide that's coming out will probably in most of these scenarios have good, better, best. And one example many of us heard was the climbing tower, which Winona hasn't cleaned our climbing tower, I think, ever. We let it get cleaned by the rain, but you know, good would be to clean it once a day, better would be to clean it you know, a couple times a day, and best would probably be to clean it in between different cohorted groups of campers who are using it. So I think for most of our activities, again, they won't be canceled necessarily as much as they will be held to a certain guidelines.
Can I, while we're on the subject of cleaning and disinfecting, can I have one of our panelists or someone talk about, there's been much publicity around the trouble in finding disinfecting supplies and just janitorial supplies more generally. Has anyone had experience to date in either successfully or unsuccessfully obtaining those sorts of things? Terry?
I actually spoke with our, we work with Supply Works, which is also Home Depot Pro. And I had placed an order, I think a week ago, for some different things that we needed. We have a very small water system, so we go through a lot of bleach. And I was told that it was back ordered and nobody had any dates. I did talk to our representative this morning, and they're switching over to a different, I think, company. So she was going to work on that for me. So I think contact with, you know, not just getting online and placing your orders, but actually contacting with your companies is really important. The other thing I discovered when I talked to her this morning was she was able to get some hand sanitizer for us, which I hadn't been able to order online. And she told me that the issues with getting hand sanitizer is actually not around the hand sanitizer, it's around the bottling of hand sanitizer. The bottling company can't keep up with the amount of what's going on. So that was kind of an interesting factoid that's happening with Purell. But there are some different ways, I guess, that they're starting to work on that. I was able to get toilet paper and paper towels just fine. So those were the two things I was kind of stumped with, was the bleach and the hand sanitizer. And we'll probably use bleach and water as our primary disinfectant also.
Mike Douglas, do you have a good source for cleaning supplies?
Yeah, I mean, it was really easy. I went to the main paper, they're out of Bangor, and I just said I needed kind of bleach, hand sanitizer, wipes, all that. And we set up an account and they're delivering it on Monday.
Brilliant. It's a big source of anxiety just lifted. I lost my train of thought, Laura.
Okay, great. Let's go to some other on the Bobby list here. How about staff time off? Bobby, what are you thinking about how you're going to handle staff time off on site?
Absolutely. I'm going to step back for just a quick shake while it's still in my head to talk about the sanitizing and being on top of that. What we also need to remember is if all of us can get through, obviously, travel day and then that first week, remember what we're establishing here at camp is very much what the families are doing in their homes right now. You're just having your own small community that's a bubble. So we like to think that if we do create that and are healthy, then we don't necessarily need to be less careful, but nothing will be coming into the camp that we think could be dangerous to us. So it may be an easier scenario as our weeks progress as far as knowing that we are healthy. Just a thought on that one. Also, staff time off. So can we all remember that everybody still hear me here? I just lost my video, but there we are. Okay, thanks. That these are college students in many cases, as we know, and sometimes, very honestly, they're not as good decision makers as we like them to be, but that we're going to have to impress upon every one of our staff members this year that every decision that they make not only affects them, but affects the entire community in more than it ever has. So I think if we can get their trust and establish rules, that's going to be a help. We are absolutely going to have an administrative staff in the off-duty counselor area to oversee it at all times. We're going to establish an area just off our campgrounds that off-duty staff can go to that will be comfortable. Hopefully it'll have internet, which is an issue for us. I know it's an issue for many camps, but we'll also have perhaps a barbecue area. One of the great joys of a day off at summer camp, as we all know for the staff members, is to be able to go out and have a meal outside the camp. So we're going to try and arrange for some takeout to be brought in for that group, no question about that. And we'll obviously alter when they can leave and where they can go, obviously. But the key, of course, is to make sure that they understand well that they can not leave these campgrounds, because that, as all of us know, spoils the entire equation if that happens.
Great. Terry, what are some of your thoughts on how you're going to handle, you have shorter sessions. How do you have a designated day off each week for your staff?
It's actually usually we have 12-day sessions, and it's usually one night per week. And then like about 50 some hours in between sessions. So I need to do a little more research on what can happen in between sessions. But as far as the during sessions, when we have a group of kids and everybody's been together, our plan is, much like Bobby was talking about, to try to have something right on site. We're thinking about, maybe we're going to have less kids here regardless, so maybe taking our theater building and sort of turning it into, not really, we have a staff lounge, but it would be something different. So maybe just being able to show movies, bring in food, have some other things in that particular area. We're actually going to talk to our staff about it and see what some of their ideas are, and some of the things that they would like, as well as making sure laundry is available to them and some of the other stuff that they do on their time off. I think if we can feed them and make the food exciting, I think that will help things considerably, because a lot of times they leave at 6 o'clock and they go out and get a good meal and they're back here by 8:30 or 9 anyway. So I'm hopeful that we can really work through that and make it something that does not impede them working at camp this summer.
Internet plus food. Good equation.
Exactly.
You got. Leslie brings up a good point. Will off-duty staff be able to mingle on that particular I'm sorry, it's moving too fast for my eyesight. I think the question was, could differently cohorted staff mingle on their day off, not without protections of social distancing and masks? So for those of us who have larger staffs that we anticipate will be cohorted into different places in camp, you're going to have to try to plan for their days off to be with staff who they've already cohorted with. And all of you are about to throw something at your computer monitors at me when you say, well, how can one whole age group have all the staff on their day off on the same day? We're struggling with that question also. But if we only have one location for staff to take time off on camp, we're going to have to, for example, have 2 days that our junior staff are going to be using that facility. Then we're going to wipe it down. And then for the next 2 days, intermediate staff are going to be using it for their days off. And then we wipe it down. And then the senior staff use it the other 2 days. So unless you have multiple spaces on camp, and you have if you have a small staff and they're cohorting together, then this won't be as much of an issue. But if you have a large staff that's already cohorting separately, you're going to have to watch their time off also, not just keep them on site, but watch how they interact. Matt had a couple other good questions there about staff training. So this is a great question. Staff training, how are we going to do staff training? Terry gave some really good examples already. A lot of stuff is online and can be asked to have your staff complete that before they arrive. But certainly we're not going to have multiple amounts of instructors coming into our camps, nor are we going to be sending our staff who are cohorting safely to go to another camp for staff training. So we're going to have to get inventive with a lot of on-site in-service for our own training. And Ron and Maine summer camps are going to come out with even more information about, there have been American Red Cross and some other governing agencies have extended many of the certifications that are out there now.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. There was, I believe, some information, American Red Cross, like just as one small example, American Red Cross, I believe, gave everyone the option to extend a lifeguard certification for an additional, was it 60 or 90 days, something along those lines. So I think that there's ways that certifications are going to be available even if you can't send staff to the certification clinic, right?
Right, and I think there's going to be some online options for sure. And I think there's going to be some, maybe not waiving of certification and requirements from the state, but understanding that you've demonstrated you've done the best you can do to get certain staff up to speed on their particular activity. So we're hoping to get more guidance of what demonstration is going to look like.
Karen had a good sort of hybrid question that sort of crosses over staff cohorting and certifications. How are camps anticipating running specialized activities with staff in cohorts? For instance, can one archery counselor mask and socially distance and teach all cohorts or smallest practical groups? Have any of you considered that yet?
I am hoping that that's the case, that we can have our archery specialists masked up and, you know, working with the different groups as they come through. I think we need to think it through a little bit more, but as far as I understand physical distancing right now, I think it's likely that we should be able to do that. Teaching archery with a mask on could be a little challenging, but we'll figure things out as we go along, I guess.
Thanks, Terry. Anyone
It's a
else?
naturally social distance activity, so we got that going for us, which is good with archery.
Right. Just for a second here, I think what one silver lining on this one is that we're going to get a little bit more time pre-camp with our staff to be able to figure out all these strategies as to how classes will run and how teams will run. And I think we'll be a little better prepared this year than any other year for what makes this year different than other years in camp.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bobby, for that. What we had a couple other things on here. I think we've covered most of the things Bobby said at the beginning of the meeting, although one was travel day, about campers traveling to camp. Did you want to elaborate on that or what you're thinking about?
Sure. You know, travel day is going to be interesting. So the parents of your mid-Atlantic and East Coast families have decided to drive for Camp Wigwam. That would be, obviously we're going to establish a staging area where families will drop their children off. It's actually off the campgrounds. If there's testing available at that point, the quick test, we're absolutely going to try that for campers at that point. We'll see how readily available that is. But parents will say their goodbyes there. Then ultimately, we're going to bring the campers into camp. For campers who are flying, we've obviously planned, as I'm sure most camps have, to send out a kit and directions with mask, gloves, that sort of thing. And our escorting staff members will make sure that campers have as little contact as possible with anyone else in either the airport or on the planes. And then our goal is just to get them here. And whether we use a charter bus with proper social distancing or however that works out, get the boys here, do the staging area as we did with the families, and then bring the boys into camp. Obviously, there's a certain amount of anxiety for all of us on the travel day, and that will all pan out as we get direction from the state as to what they might suggest and proper procedures that we'll develop during our orientation week. But let's get everybody here and try to establish that community, I think, is our goal for everyone.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw in a topic that we didn't mention at the top of the hour, but I think it's important for everyone here on this call who's planning to open or leaning towards opening, which is how we respond to our communities in which our camps are located. And Bobby just outlined some of the ways in which he's going to go about safely bringing campers and staff to camp. Any of you who've been looking on social media, anytime a article or a TV clip, a news clip about camps opening goes up on social media, the comments are really difficult to read at times. So one thing to remember is Ron's going to be on Maine Calling next Wednesday, and we're supposed to all jam the phone lines with happy comments. Ron, can he talk again about the value of Maine summer camp? But no, seriously, we will need to, all of us need to create, whether it's a policy that's written down or something that we actually just have in the back of our minds running at all times, which is how are we continually working with our community to remind them, not only demonstrate how we're going to do camp safely, but how we're going to protect them and how we're going to respect them about their community and their concerns. So I know, for example, some of you had a conversation last week, or no, it was this week, the days are blurring together, with the Naples Select Board. And I'm wondering if anyone on here might want to, I heard it went positive, and maybe you have some guidelines for us as why that was positive, what you were able to share with the Naples selectmen to appease maybe some fears or questions they had. Who's on here? Jeff, were you part of that?
I was. I'm happy
Great.
to jump in. They were just calling to find out, are we planning on opening? How are we going to run our camps? I think they were happy to hear that we have, some pretty good protocols in place that we're looking to basically isolate on property and just stay together and not, sort of cohort with them in town. And the way we worded it, it was Arlene was on and Dan from Mattapanai. We said, look, we've loved taking advantage of your community and being a part of the community and spending money in the community, but you got to give us a pass this year. And we're going to just basically quarantine on our own properties, and we're not going to be out and about. And I think they were relieved to hear that. It was also important in these small towns to sort of differentiate summer camp from campgrounds. I mean, that was another topic, because a lot of our communities all have campgrounds, these KOAs, where people are coming and going every single week. And we were very, clear to differentiate what we do from a campground, where you have people that literally are coming in with their cars. They can drive off property every single day. They come every single weekend or week, whatever they do, going into the supermarkets, going into the stores. A lot of the KOAs, at least in the Naples region, to their credit, plan on implementing things where you will be able to go to somebody at the KOA and place an order, whether it's for food, groceries, and it'll be picked up for you. So they're trying to contain even the KOAs, but we really were also trying to differentiate ourselves from that sort of a business.
Great. Jeff, thank you for sharing that. I gotta say, we were nervous, and we're so glad that went as well as could be expected. And
it was great.
We hope, yeah, great. And we hope that other folks, if you're called in front of your select board and need some guidance on that, please contact Micah, and we'll give you, what we've heard that has been successful thus far. Again, we have been thankful for the main media that have been keeping things very positive. Ron's been doing an awesome job keeping the conversation very positive at the local, state, and national, because Ron is interviewed nationally on a regular basis. Okay, Matt's got a couple other things to lob out to people.
Yeah, so Chelsea raised a question about, are any of the day camps on the call still planning to allow off-campus trips, outings to outdoor state parks where social distancing is still possible, or a day camp thinking about eliminating off-campus trips altogether? So is there anyone on here who's still figuring out how to run off-campus trips for day camps?
Bobby, you can go ahead.
I'm sorry, day camps, I can't answer on the day camps. I guess I will answer on the overnight that we have a
Yeah.
fairly substantial golf program at Camp Wigwam. And I think we're still going to try to go to the golf driving range. And ultimately we've figured out with golf courses that we can pay ahead of time and send groups to the golf course. And I'd love anybody else's opinion on if we think we can take day trips to remote camping areas close to camp. We think we can, but I'd love other opinions on that as
Matt Cornish, do you mind elaborating on your comment that you just put in the chat and why you made that decision?
Yeah, so we normally heavily rely on transportation as a day camp to camp in the morning, but also for trips, we rent vans, things like that. And just from our interpretation of what's out there, we just don't feel like, number one, that we can effectively be able to maintain any sort of social distancing in our transportation in any way, shape, or form. It's going to work for us. Unless we were to be able to rent 3 times the number of buses that we have, and that's just not going to happen. So if we run, we're not going to be offering transportation at all, and that includes off-site trips.
And why are you saying 3 times the number of buses?
Just to be able to to keep the right distance. I don't know if you want to jump in on that, Deb, but to keep the right amount of space between people riding on buses.
Yeah, we fill our buses morning and night going home, and then we have vans for day trips, and there's no way you can adequately put kids on all these buses and keep them social distanced. We already have all these, bus monitors. I mean, it's a very expensive operation for us to run, to offer the transportation, and to then add more bus monitors to ensure that this is working the way it's supposed to, I think it's just costly, and we're not going to do it. And I think, we're going to run if we run our camp, we're running it entirely outdoors and under covered spaces on rainy days, only to use the bathrooms and then frequently clean. So we're kind of going that extra steps to make sure that we are super safe, and transportation to me just kind of falls into that real risky category, so we're not doing it.
Sure.
Great.
Sorry, Laura.
You mentioned the question from
I think it was
Steven?
Jeff, actually, Jeff Newman.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Has anyone put together messaging on how to respond to parents when they ask, why can your camp open up safely when so many camps are closing for safety and health reasons? Yeah, it's an excellent question, and we're working with that here at Winona too. I am buoyed by the fact that camps in Maine who have closed are really careful about their messaging and making sure that they're not saying, we're closing because it's not safe to be at camp this summer. Many of you heard the NPR piece this morning that didn't end on a great note with the national, I can't remember, but she was a parent, and the child got queued up really well to say, no one should be at camp this summer. So that is a struggle for us. The way we're handling it, and I'm sorry, I have a teenager in the background preparing her lunch. That's that noise. The way we're handling it is we're talking about respecting camps' decisions to close, and then moving the conversation into why we think Winona, in our physical location, has certain attributes that make us able to, at least for now, continue down the path of trying to remain open for part of the summer. And in some cases, it's about the fact that we have the ability to serve multiple meals out of dining halls. We have the ability to have 2 dining halls. We are already in cohorted smaller groups. Our physical our facility in general allows us to adhere to some of the policies. I don't want to get into the weeds here, but that's pretty much been the tactic of just acknowledging camps are making the decision. There's no right or wrong answer, and that we're making the decision to remain open for these. And then I list out 3 or 4 important reasons that all current parents and alumni would understand. What about Terry? What are some of the things you've been messaging about continuing to still try and move forward?
I'm in a little bit of a different situation, I think, with some of my families. I'm actually getting, my families really want to have camp and don't really understand why we would even be considering not having camp. That is a lot of what I hear. So I'm actually getting emails to the reverse of, if you don't have camp, that is absolutely ridiculous, rather than what are you going to do to keep my child safe? So one of the things that we're doing, and I think Pam actually has listed some of this out, but just that we're just going to focus on, you know, specifically what we are doing. Like, here are the expectations you can have. Camp's not going to look like it normally does. These are the measures that we're putting in place, and not really doing sort of a compare or contrast with anything, because we just want to stay out of that completely.
Excellent point.
Matt and Laura, I just want to go back to something Bob Strauss talked about, and that is wilderness trips. And based on conversations that I've had, and based on what they're putting out in terms of guide trips and such, I would anticipate that you're going to be looking at your cohorts that you have within your camp being able to go to remote places. But it would have to remain within your cohorts, particularly during the first few weeks of camp.
And my understanding is, if Matthew brought up a good point about the possibility they would have had to have 3 times the number of buses because you have to de-densify when you're in those certain situations, and bus travel is one of the challenges for sure. How do you de-densify and make it economically reasonable? So in vans, if you're transporting by van, you not necessarily would have to de-densify, because that's not reasonable, but you would have to make sure that that van is a cohorted group as much as possible, and you'd probably have to use the practice of wearing face masks during that van ride when people are enclosed in a space like that. All right. I apologize if we haven't been able to keep up with the chat there. I really thank Matt for jumping in here when it was supposed to be his hour off. So thank you. Ron, is there anything else as we're wrapping up here? Is there anything else that you'd like to mention before we close out?
Well, not really, but we should note that we know that the guidelines are scheduled to come out on Wednesday. We are working hard to get the state to release them to us before Wednesday, so that camps will have time to communicate with their parents before they read it on the state's website or hear it on TV. And along with that, we will be scheduling another town meeting next week when it's appropriate. And if any of you, unfortunately, our webinar program handles up to 500 people, but we learned today that our meeting aspect of Zoom only handled 100 people. So some people have been cut out of this, but we have recorded it and we will make it available.
Ron, great, thank you. And I'd like to do a big clap for Ron for all that he's done. It's absolutely amazing. I'll check your overtime in September. And I'd also like to give a big thank you to Terry and Bobby, who were again volunteered for this, and to share where they're at right now and where we're heading. So again, thank you. Some of us it's been a long morning of meetings. We all need to go and stretch and take a deep breath outside. And like Ron said, we'll see you next week, and we'll send out those announcements. Thank you, everyone.